This episode of Lines of Inquiry is supported by Shopify. There's a moment at the beginning of any new venture where the scale of what you're trying to build becomes clear. An idea might start small, a product, a brand, even a podcast like Lines of Inquiry. But very quickly the list grows. Design, payments, marketing, orders, customer questions. Running a business means wearing a lot of hats, and often it can feel like you're doing it alone. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names to brands just getting started. It allows you to build a professional online store with hundreds of ready-to-use templates designed to match your brand's style. Shopify also includes powerful AI tools that help write product descriptions, generate page headlines, and even enhance product photography. When it comes to finding customers, Shopify makes that easier too, with built-in tools for email campaigns and social media marketing. And behind it all is world-class expertise in everything from managing stock to international shipping and processing returns. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Support from Shopify helps us to create new episodes of this podcast every week. We couldn't do it without their support. Please support the businesses that support us. Sign up for your €1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.ie. It's time to see what you can accomplish with Shopify by your side. It's early afternoon on a cold, crisp Monday, October 4th, 2004. At Balbriggan Garda Station in North County Dublin, a call comes in concerning a burglary in progress near the Knoll village, 8 kilometres away. Detective Sergeant Pat Murray is one of the first responders. He grabs his keys and walkie-talkie and rushes from the station, not even pausing to get his jacket. In an unmarked Garda car, he hurriedly makes his way to the Knoll along twisting country roads that he knows well. Along the way, the radio crackles with updates from the first uniformed member at the scene. A woman has been injured. An ambulance is on the way. This doesn't sit well with Pat. A seasoned detective, he knows from experience that burglars are clever. They want to get in and out quickly, silently, usually in minutes. They have an escape plan and definitely don't want to get into any confrontation with a homeowner. Then another radio message comes through. The woman is dead. If this is a burglary, then it has gone terribly wrong. Minutes later, Pat arrives at the house. His superintendent, Tom Gallagher, is also there, waiting for him. "Go in there, Pat," he says, "and come back out and tell me what you see." Pat takes in as much as he can, surveying the scene, careful not to touch or disturb anything. Kitchen presses lay open. DVDs are scattered across the floor. He makes his way to the hall. Blood is splattered everywhere. It's on the walls and the skirting boards, even as high as the ceiling. On the floor near the bedroom door lies the body of a woman. She has been severely beaten around her head and face. Deep wounds show the exposed bone of her skull. This has been a vicious and sustained attack. To Detective Pat Murray, this does not look like the work of someone trying to get away as quickly as possible after having been disturbed during a burglary. The assailant had made sure that the woman was dead. Then he makes his way back outside, where the super is waiting. "Well," he says to Pat, "what did you see?" "I saw two things," the detective sergeant answers. "Number one, it wasn't a burglary. And number two, the killer really hated that lady." When a person is killed in Ireland, the Gardaí turn to the forensic examiners of the Technical Bureau. For 25 years, I was one of them. I'm John Sweetman. At crime scenes, I learned to listen to what the evidence was saying and what the killer was trying to silence. A smudged print, a misplaced everyday object, the smallest detail that revealed the truth. Now in this GoLoud original podcast, I return to some of Ireland's most compelling cases. This is Lines of Inquiry, a podcast that follows the evidence and reveals the story behind each case. In this episode of Lines of Inquiry, the murder of 30-year-old Rachel O'Reilly, a burglary gone horribly wrong, or the work of a callous killer much closer to home. An investigation with several key players, and a closing net spurred on by dogged police work, technical wizardry, and even RTE's popular Friday night programme, The Late Late Show. On the morning of Monday the 4th of October 2004, 30-year-old Rachel O'Reilly left her home in the rural townland of Beldara, near the Knoll in North County Dublin, to drop her eldest son Luke to school and her younger boy Adam at creche. It was a new routine for the family, which began that September when the boys, aged 4 and 2, had started school and creche. Rachel would usually head to the gym after dropping off the boys, but she had injured her thigh in a hockey match over the weekend, so she headed back home instead. Ever since she was young, Rachel had actively participated in all sorts of sports: hockey, shot put, badminton, swimming and softball. She could often be found shouting at her team from the sidelines. In April of 2004, she had been part of the softball team that entered the Guinness Book of Records for the world's longest softball match, which had lasted a whole weekend. Rachel had made plans with her friend Jackie O'Connor to call around to her house for a chat. She was also planning a Halloween party for Adam's 3rd birthday in a few weeks. Although they were relatively new to the area, the family had already begun to make friends locally, and Rachel wanted to get invitations to the party out. Rachel and her husband Joe had moved to the house in Beldara the year before, as their previous home was too small for their growing family. The area was rural and quiet, nestled among open fields near the border of Meath and Dublin. The house, Lambay View, was a secluded 3-bedroom dormer bungalow with views out to the Irish Sea. They had a large garden, and despite not being much of a gardener, Rachel loved nature and taught her boys to be kind even to bugs and spiders. Still, she had thrown herself into making it a perfect home in which to bring up her 2 boys, and she was comfortable and secure there. Her brother had warned her against her habit of leaving the back door open, but she told them she felt safe in her new home. The only negative was that Joe would have to drive into the city in rush hour traffic every day. He now had a managerial position in Viacom, an advertising company based in the Bluebell Industrial Estate on the south side of Dublin City. His job entailed coordinating the company's bill posters division, which placed ads on the sides of buses and in train stations. His work also involved having to go out to stations and bus depots to check up on the work. Rachel had given up her job in a solicitor's office, but became an agent for Avon Cosmetics and Tupperware, as well as doing a small amount of work for her former boss. At 9:45 a.m, a local dairy farmer, James McNally, drove past Lambay View on his way to his brother's house. He noticed Rachel's car in the driveway. He also saw that the curtains of the house were drawn. A short time later, around 10 a.m, the local milkman reversed into the driveway of the O'Reilly's house. He too saw Rachel's car, and also noted that the curtains were drawn, which he thought was unusual. The O'Reilly's 2 dogs were outside. When the milkman left his delivery at the front of the house, he heard a noise like a door being slammed. At 12 o'clock, Joe tried ringing Rachel's phone for a chat and left her a voicemail. He wasn't too worried when he got no answer, telling her, "Obviously you're just in Jackie's chewing the fat and not listening to messages from me." When Rachel failed to turn up at the creche to collect her son at 12:30 p.m, the principal of the Montessori, Helen Moore, tried contacting her by phone, but the call just went to voicemail. At around 1 p.m, she decided to phone Rachel's husband, Joe. He said that Rachel was supposed to be meeting a friend that morning. Perhaps she had been delayed. He told Helen he would try calling Rachel himself. When there was no answer, he tried Jackie O'Connor, who Rachel had plans to meet that morning. But Jackie told him Rachel had never shown up. At Rachel's parents' home, around 25 kilometres away in Dublin City, her mother, Rose Callaly, was preparing lunch. Rachel's father, Jim, who had a plumbing business, was working from home that day, doing some painting around the house. Also there helping were Rose and Jim's 3 sons, Declan, Paul and Anthony. Jim and Rose Callaly had 5 children, 2 girls and 3 boys, all adopted. Each of the kids came to them as babies, only a few weeks old. Rachel was born on the 10th of October 1973, and when the Callalys first met her, she was lying in a cot in the ward. She stretched out her tiny arms to Jim. That was the way she was, all through her life, full of love and affection. Jim used to think of her as a little girl out of the fairy tale books, like Heidi or Alice in Wonderland. She had a head of blonde hair that shone silver white in the sun. She was a lively and adventurous child. Rose remembers one particular occasion when Rachel was still only a toddler. She was pottering around the house between the kitchen and the living room. Then she went out of sight and things got very quiet. Concerned by the lack of noise, Rose rushed into the living room, where she saw little Rachel in the process of trying to climb up the chimney. She was covered from head to toe in black soot, with just her 2 bright eyes peeking out from behind all the dirt. It wouldn't be the last time that she attempted this particular caper. Eventually, the chimney was blocked up, so she had to find other outlets for her inexhaustible energy. Later, as Rachel grew and attended school, she learned to play the harp and took up gymnastics. When Rachel did not appear to collect her son on the 4th of October 2004, Joe called her parents home just as they were about to sit down to the mixed grill Rose had made them for lunch. Anthony, Rachel's brother, answered. Joe said that the creche had contacted him, telling him that Rachel hadn't picked up their youngest son. He said that he was on his way to pick him up and would also pick up the older boy from school. Joe said that he had been trying to contact Rachel all morning, but she wasn't answering, and he was very worried. Rachel's father, Jim, wondered if it might be a good idea if someone contacted one of Rachel and Joe's neighbours to go and check at the house. Rachel did all of the DIY and gardening. Perhaps she had fallen off a ladder or something. Jim contacted the creche and got a number for a friend of Rachel's, Sarah Harmon, who lived nearby. Rose had also tried reaching Rachel on her mobile and landline, but there was no answer. It was now around 1:20 p.m, and Rose decided to drive out to Beldara herself. If the traffic wasn't too bad, she would be able to make the journey in about 20 minutes. She told Joe she would meet him there. When Rachel and Joe had married, they had lived near her parents in a house in Alden Grange in Santry. But in March of 2000, they had welcomed their first child, a boy, and in October of the following year, their second son was born. They now needed a bigger house for themselves and began searching for somewhere suitable. Another reason to move was so that Joe could have a separate room for his Star Wars memorabilia. Joe was nuts about Star Wars and had a huge collection of action figures, spaceships and the like. He even had a Darth Vader costume. Darth Vader was his favourite. Rachel had met Joe O'Reilly when she had a part-time job in Arnott's when she was 17 years old. Joe was about a year and a half older than her and worked in the haberdashery department. He had grown up in Kilbarrack on the north side of the city. It wasn't very serious at the beginning, but Rachel soon fell for him. She never went out with anybody else. Joe was all she wanted out of life. She idolised him. He was well over 6 foot tall. Rachel was tall too, and he later spoke about the statuesque blonde, saying, "I'd noticed her straight away because she's so tall. It can be hard finding a tall woman in Ireland." It seemed like a perfect match. They both loved sports. Joe was a Kempo black belt, and they had grown up only a few miles apart. For some reason, Rose could never really take to Joe. She felt Joe considered himself an authority on everything. But over time, he was welcomed and included in family occasions. Despite her reservations, Rose did have to admit that Joe seemed like a decent, helpful person who always seemed to say the right thing. Rachel's friends found him kind and funny, someone they could talk to, and who would rent vans to help them move or run out onto the softball pitch with a first aid kit. After about 4 years together, Joe proposed to Rachel at the top of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. The big day was the 4th of April 1997. Jim was emotional as he walked his daughter up the aisle and handed her over to Joe, referring to his daughter's new husband as the man who was to cherish and protect her from then on. The day went perfectly, except for one little hiccup. The photographer had forgotten to take a picture of Jim walking Rachel up the aisle. Everyone laughed about it. Rachel removed her wedding ring, and they did it again so a photograph could be taken. For Rose, it felt like an unlucky thing to have done, like trying to turn back time and undo what had already been done. As Rose Callaly drove along the motorway towards Beldara, the sun was shining. It was cold, but a beautiful, crisp day. Her mind was racing, but she tried to remain positive. Surely, if Rachel had been in a car accident, someone would have contacted her. When Rose pulled into the driveway to Lambay View at 1:45 p.m, she was relieved to see Rachel's car parked in its usual spot. As Rose pulled in, Joe called Rachel's phone again. In another voicemail, he told her he was heading home, that he'd been crying, and he told her he was worried. Again, he asked her to call him back. The O'Reillys rarely used the front door, so Rose went to the back. She saw the curtains were drawn. She'd never seen them closed before. The family dogs, a Labrador and a Springer Spaniel, were huddled together by the hedge along the right of the driveway. Normally they would run over, excitedly greeting any visitor, but they hung back sheepishly. The patio door was open, but the dogs made no attempt to follow Rose into the house. Inside, the closed curtains made the kitchen dark. Clothes were folded on the floor. One of the taps was running at full blast into the sink, and bits and pieces from the kitchen drawers were scattered on the floor. Rose continued deeper into the house, calling Rachel's name. In the living room, more cabinets lay open. Videos and DVDs littered the floor. Rose made her way into the hallway with a sickening feeling in her stomach. Something was very wrong. Rose checked the boys' room. All seemed okay there, so she began to make her way across the hall to Rachel and Joe's room. As she got closer, Rose noticed the blood that was splattered in the hall and on the door. It was everywhere. On the walls, on the ceiling. Rose would later compare it to an abattoir. Rose looked down. Just inside the door of the main bedroom, she saw Rachel. Her blonde hair was completely matted with thick blood. There was so much of it that her head was partially stuck to the floor. Rose couldn't tell if Rachel was lying to the side or face down because of all the blood. Rose knew that her daughter was dead. She knelt down beside her, repeating her name over and over, and rubbed her arms. She was cold to the touch. Through all the horror, Rose was still aware that she mustn't touch anything. She tried to phone Jim, but her fingers wouldn't find the right numbers. She couldn't even dial 999. By complete fluke, she managed to get through to someone, and frantically told the man on the end of the line that she thought her daughter was dead. One of Rachel's friends, Sarah Harmon, who had been called to look for her, arrived shortly after Rose. She could hear Rose's screams from the road outside. Sarah rang the emergency services and they asked her to check Rachel for a pulse. She found none. Around 2:20, another friend who had collected Rachel and Joe's older son Luke from school arrived. The boy had to be stopped from running into the house. Joe drove in just after, with 3-year-old Adam. Joe smiled at Rose. She quickly told him that she thought Rachel was dead. She couldn't bring herself to say murdered. "Who's dead?" asked the older of Rachel's sons. Rose reassured him that everything was okay, and in his innocence, the boy walked away with Rachel's friend, blissfully unaware for the time being. Joe walked into the house and Rose followed, telling him where Rachel was. When he saw his wife's body, he uttered, "Jesus, Rachel, what did you do?" He moved the box of books that was near her head and knelt down beside her to place 2 fingers on her neck, checking for a pulse. When Rachel's best friend, Jackie O'Connor, a nurse, arrived at the house to check up on her following Joe's call earlier that day, he told her to go down and see if you could do something. She could find no signs of life. 2 paramedics arrived on the scene shortly after, followed minutes later by gardai. By 2:45 p.m, an hour after Rose had first arrived, they had sealed off the crime scene. Joe told Garda Thomas Cleary that he had touched Rachel and moved a box near the body. Joe said to Garda Cleary, "I'm really sorry. I'm probably after ruining it on you." Detective Sergeant Pat Murray had responded to the call about a burglary in which a woman had been injured. On his way out to Beldara, it came across the Garda radio that the woman was dead. When Pat arrived at Lambay View, he saw several uniformed Gardaí outside, as well as a small group of people, relatives of the victim, huddled together in the chill air, obviously in distress. Off to one side there was a tall, stocky, dark-haired man standing on his own. The husband. He seemed to be in a daze. Superintendent Tom Gallagher was waiting for him. "Go in there, Pat," he said, "and come back out and tell me what you see." Pat donned the scenes of crime suit and stepped through the back door. Everyone else had been told to stay outside. It was just Detective Sergeant Murray alone with Rachel's lifeless body. Pat's unease grew as he surveyed the scene inside. His years of experience processed the scene and calculated what he saw and what it told him. The table lay askew. Drawers were pulled out, cabinets opened, bits and pieces of household items strewn across the floor. It didn't seem right. Burglars don't bother with kitchen drawers. They typically go for bedroom lockers, jewellery boxes and the like. To Pat it looked like a non-burglar's idea of a burglary. Staged, unconvincing. He bent down to look at Rachel's body, ever careful not to touch or move anything. He noticed a small box with blood on it nearby. It seemed out of place. This was one of the boxes that Joe had moved minutes earlier. Pat saw the blood on the walls and skirting boards. Some of it went even as high as the ceiling. When blood hits a surface, it leaves a pattern and begins to dry. Pat could make out fresher blood spatter on top of dried blood. This told him that the attack on Rachel had been frenzied, that the assailant had assaulted her and then, after a period of time, had attacked her again. This couldn't be the work of any burglar, who would be looking to get out of the house as quickly as possible. Having carried out a preliminary assessment of the scene, Pat returned outside, where his super was waiting. "Well," said Tom Gallagher, "What did you see?" Pat replied, "I saw two things. Number one, it wasn't a burglary. Number two, the killer really hated that lady." The superintendent agreed, and Pat added, "I'd say the victim knew her killer." The super nodded, "Exactly." Then he told Pat to go and talk to the husband, Joe O'Reilly. Pat noticed that Joe O'Reilly didn't seem very upset, but rather detached. Maybe it was shock. The detective introduced himself and told Joe that he'd be heading up the investigation. The first thing Joe said was that he'd been in the house and had moved the small box that was on the floor near to Rachel's body. The box Pat saw inside. The box that looked out of place. Pat asked Joe for his mobile number and arranged to meet him later that evening at his mother's house. He also advised him not to talk to the media and to let the investigation team do its work. The Technical Bureau team arrived and began their lengthy examination of the scene. Jobs were assigned, house-to-house inquiries had to be carried out, checkpoints were set up to question drivers in the vicinity if they had seen anything that might prove important. CCTV footage needed to be collected if possible. Search teams began fanning out from Lambay View, looking for anything that might be of evidential value, and possibly even the murder weapon. The house was surrounded by countryside. There would be a lot of ground to cover. This was just the beginning, that time when the journey begins with no clear end in sight. Later that evening, Detective Sergeant Pat Merry and two colleagues met with Joe O'Reilly at his mother's house. After nearly 20 minutes waiting, Joe appeared out of the shower. He was calm and composed. Pat thought Joe showed remarkable control of his emotions for a man whose wife had been beaten to death only hours earlier. The detectives asked him if he could think of anyone who might have wanted to harm Rachel. Could she have been having an affair? Maybe it was a disgruntled wife. Joe replied, "No, neither of us were having affairs." Pat had only asked about Rachel. He made a note of the reply in his notebook. He pressed Joe about the possibility that he was having an affair. He denied it again. The interview moved on as Joe was asked if he'd had his mobile phone on him all day. He said that he had, but when he was asked to provide the number again, he gave a different one to that which he had given earlier at the scene. Surprised, Pat asked him about this, and Joe explained that earlier he thought that the detective had wanted Rachel's number. Pat was sure he'd asked Joe for his number. Pat Merry learned little about Rachel from the conversation, aside from one detail. Joe told the detective that an anonymous complaint about Rachel's parenting had resulted in a visit from a social worker, but that social services were happy with what they had seen. Joe's mother had already washed the clothes he had been wearing that day, so the detectives asked for the footwear he'd had on at the scene. As Joe handed over his black boots, Pat looked him in the eye and asked again, "Are you sure you weren't having an affair?" This time, Joe made eye contact with the detective and admitted the truth. He had had an affair with a former work colleague, Nicky Pelly. He also said that he'd been in contact with her around noon that day. He insisted that while it had previously been rocky, his relationship with his wife had been back on steady ground. He was asked to account for his whereabouts that day. He said that he'd gotten up at 5:20 a.m, having slept in the spare room so he wouldn't disturb Rachel. He then drove his navy blue Fiat Marea estate the half hour to his gym on the Nanger Road, where he met with a work colleague, Derek Quirney. After the gym, Joe headed to work at Viacom in the Bluebell Industrial Estate, arriving at 7:15 a.m. At 8:15 a.m, he drove to Phibsborough bus depot to talk with a particular employee. Derek Quirney had gone there too, in his own car. Joe said that when he arrived at the bus depot, he couldn't find the employee, and when Pat Mary asked him if he'd checked in the canteen, Joe replied, "There's too many canteens." But later in the investigation, it was found that there were in fact only two. Joe also said that he spoke to nobody other than Derek Querney at the depot. Joe continued. He said at 11:20 a.m. he left Phibsborough and went back to Viacom. It was around midday when he got there. Then, at 1:30 p.m, Montessori principal Helen Moore had phoned him, saying that Rachel hadn't picked up their youngest son from the creche. After ringing around to ask if anyone had seen Rachel, Joe made his way home, stopping to collect his sons along the way. Pat Mary and his colleagues took detailed notes of Joe's account. They would have to chase up on any CCTV to corroborate Joe's movements, but they seemed to have nearly 4 hours from 8:15 a.m. to midday in which his only alibi was Derek Querney. Before the detectives left, Pat Mary once again asked for Joe's mobile number, and once again he gave Rachel's. Later that day, Gardaí spoke to Derek Querney and around 30 Viacom employees, both past and present. Derek Querney's statement seemed to corroborate Joe's account of his movements, but also included other interesting details. Querney said that he'd heard Joe having rows with his wife over the phone. He also confirmed that Joe was having an affair with Nikki Pelly, and that it was known about by others. Investigating Gardaí also questioned Nikki Pelly the day Rachel was murdered. She admitted to the affair and stated that Joe regularly stayed with her on Tuesday and Saturday nights. But she didn't mention that she had had any contact with Joe on the day of Rachel's murder. The detectives had started to examine CCTV footage from the Phibsborough bus depot, where Joe had said he'd spent the morning on the day of the murder. No one there had seen or spoken to him that morning, and the CCTV that covered the yard area was out of service that day. Only the internal cameras had been operational. Gardaí could see that Derek Querney had entered an area with CCTV coverage at 9:26 a.m, but no camera caught sight of Joe O'Reilly at any time. No one had seen the 6'5" man in the bright blue jacket. There was no evidence to show that he had ever been there. If O'Reilly had gone searching for the employee he'd said he'd been looking for, maybe in the canteen, he would have shown up on a camera. But he told Detective Sergeant Pat Mary that there were too many canteens to go checking them all. The day after the murder, on the 5th of October, Rachel O'Reilly's body was removed from the scene at Lambay View. Her car keys were found beneath her. This suggested that she had just come in from the car when she was attacked. State pathologist Dr. Mary Cassidy carried out the autopsy on Rachel's body. It was her opinion that Rachel had tried to defend herself and may have lain dying for hours. She had been struck a number of times on her head, fracturing her skull. It couldn't be determined exactly how many blows she had sustained, as that would depend on what sort of weapon had been used. And, so far, the murder weapon hadn't been found. Dr. Cassidy explained that the injury to Rachel's forehead indicated how the first blow likely struck her when she had been standing up. Then the rest of the injuries were inflicted as she lay on the floor, unconscious. She had inhaled blood, and a fracture to the back of her skull had damaged her brain, causing her death. Forensically, the scene at Lambay View did not yield any crucial evidence. Any fingerprints that were developed were identified as having been made by people who had legitimate access: Joe, Rose, and Rachel herself. Rachel's blood was found on Joe's boots, but it could be explained by him having been close to her body on the day of the murder. Despite the blood spatter, which would have left the killer drenched in blood, there were no drippings anywhere else in the house. No unknown DNA was found. On the 6th of October, 2 days after Rachel's murder, detectives spoke to the Callaly family at their home. Rose told them that Joe had called her earlier that day and had told her of a dream he'd had. In it, Rachel had asked him if a dumbbell was missing from the spare room. Joe had told Rose he was sure that this missing dumbbell was the murder weapon. Then, during the technical examination, Joe O'Reilly visited the house at Beldara. He told the garda there how Rachel had come to him in a dream, telling him that things were missing from the house. Joe passed this information on to the guard, telling him that there was a brown towel missing from the hot press and a dumbbell from the spare room. He told the garda that the dumbbell could have been used as a murder weapon. While the Garda search teams hadn't found a dumbbell or towel, they did spot a brown leather satchel and a camera bag, placed in a drain about 1/4 mile from Lambay View. The bags were labelled with the O'Reillys' name and address and were clearly visible from the road. When the guards lifted up the satchel, a white jewellery box fell out. Inside it was a locket, brooch and Rachel's engagement ring. The other bag contained a camcorder. Both were clean, no DNA, no fingerprints. The experienced search team got the feeling that the bags were placed there deliberately so that they could be found easily, lending weight to the botched burglary theory. But back at Rachel and Joe's house, €860 was found in a container in the utility room, and Rachel's handbag had over €400 in it, untouched. In the days following Rachel O'Reilly's murder, Joe O'Reilly embarked on a series of media appearances, seeking any information that would help catch his wife's killer. A week after Rachel's murder, Rose, Jim and Joe appeared on a television interview which was filmed in the Callaly's living room. They each took turns speaking and swapped encouraging looks as they appealed for any information that might help capture Rachel's killer. Gardaí also issued appeals to taxi and delivery drivers as well as people who had been out walking or working on farms locally to share any information with them. When it came to organising Rachel's funeral, Joe told Rachel's parents, Jim and Rose Callaly, "Anything you decide is okay by me." Rachel O'Reilly lay in repose in Rock's funeral parlour in Swords. All the family had a chance to write letters for her and placed them in her coffin. Joe's letter was 5 pages long. He also placed inside the coffin 2 plastic toys from their sons, Adam and Luke. Rachel's family stepped out to leave Joe alone to say goodbye to his wife. No sooner had he been left in the room when a friend of the Callalys overheard Joe say to the undertaker, "You can put the lid on that now." The funeral mass took place on the 11th of October at the Holy Child Church in Whitehall, close to where Rachel had grown up. On her coffin was a piece of paper with the word "Mammy" and a Tweety Pie cuddly toy. Joe O'Reilly spoke from the altar as sobs were heard throughout the packed church. In a measured tone, he thanked Rachel for her love and for making him laugh. He spoke of her achievements in sport and in life, getting married, becoming a mother. Mission accomplished, he said. Rose and Jim waited for him to speak of his love for Rachel, or of his devastation at her loss. But it wasn't to be. He simply said, "See you on the other side. We all thank you. Bye for now." Before he stepped down, Joe, standing beside his wife's coffin, addressed Rachel's murderer. The packed church fell silent as he said, "Unlike you, she is at peace. Unlike you, she is sleeping. She forgives you, and I hope she gives me the strength to one day forgive you." The comments left Rose shocked. How could Joe claim to know what Rachel would tell them if she was alive? Joe didn't want to pay for the grave, telling the undertaker he would not be buried there. Instead, Rachel was buried in a grave bearing her maiden name, Callaly. Rose collected the cards from the flower arrangements left on the fresh grave. One card stood out to her. It read, "See you later." It was from Joe. After the Mass, friends and relatives had gathered at the Regency Hotel in Drumcondra. Joe was laughing and joking with them. A friend of Rachel's, Fiona Slevin, spoke to Joe about the search for the murder weapon. Joe said to her, "I don't know why they're searching in the fields. It's in the water." Then, after Fiona looked at him in shock, Joe corrected himself, saying, "If I'd done it, that's where it would be, because there's water all around, and it would have gotten rid of any DNA and all that sort of stuff." The day after the funeral, the guards returned the keys to Lambay View to Joe. They told him that there was a special service that would clean up crime scenes, but he didn't want to wait for that. He wanted to move back into Lambay View as soon as possible. There was still blood on the walls and ceiling in the spot where Rachel had died. On the 13th of October, Joe invited the Callalys to the house. He told them that he felt very close to Rachel there, and had experienced a great sense of peace and calmness in their home. He wondered if they would like to come and see for themselves. Rose didn't want to go, but Rachel's father, Jim, urged her to go, in the hope it might be of some help to Joe as he struggled with his grief. Reluctantly, Jim and Rose returned to the house where, just over a week before, their daughter had been brutally murdered. They went with their son Paul and his wife Denise. The Callalys arrived to the house, and Joe took them down the hall to the bedroom, the same one in which Rose had found her daughter, lying dead a week earlier. The blood was still on the walls. Then Joe clenched his fist and raised his arm and brought it down quickly, as if hitting someone only he could see. "She got a blow to the head," Joe told the group, "and then she went down." The 6'5" Joe then crouched down onto his hunkers and showed them how the murderer would have held Rachel on the floor as she was beaten. After punching the ground over and over, blow by blow, he showed them how the murderer would have gotten up and stepped over Rachel's body. Rose felt physically sick. Jim left the room. He thought he might faint. Joe walked a few feet into the bathroom, as the killer would have done, he said, to clean up. In the bathroom, Joe pointed out a drop of blood which must have dropped off the murder weapon. He said that the killer must have heard Rachel making a noise, or gurgling or whatever, and had gone back to finish her off. Rose thought to herself, "This is not happening." The Callalys turned to head out through the kitchen when Joe began to play the messages on the answering machine. It consisted mostly of messages that he had left on the day of the murder. As the others stood there listening, Joe was looking intently at them. As Rose waited for the messages to end, she heard Rachel's voice clearly in her mind. "Ma'am, he did it." It was as if Rachel was standing there beside her. "I'm telling you, ma'am, it was him. He did it." The realization felt like a kick to the stomach for Rose. Rose told Jim about it later that night. She had heard their daughter's voice. Rachel had told her who killed her. Joe had killed her. Rose was sure of it. Jim couldn't bear to hear it. He begged Rose to keep it to herself. He defended their son-in-law. He said Joe was dealing with an unimaginable trauma, and that kind of grief can do strange things to people. If Joe was acting oddly and seeming too calm about it all, then maybe that was just Joe's way of finding his way through his pain. Jim wouldn't believe it. He couldn't. He became so upset by the idea that Rose didn't mention it to him again. But Rose was sure. On the 21st of October, a little over 2 weeks after the murder, Jenny Friel, a journalist with the Irish Mail on Sunday, travelled to Lambay View. She went to meet with Joe. She found O'Reilly endearing and easy to interview, and he was happy to answer her questions, even the awkward ones. Joe was eager to describe how his wife's head had been stuck to the carpet because of the enormous amount of blood that had seeped from her wounds. He had described how he had tried to give Rachel CPR, a detail that disagreed with Rose Callaly's recollection of events. She had said that all Joe had done was try to find Rachel's pulse. Joe told Jenny that the arrival of the paramedics on the scene was like something out of Holby City, the hospital-based television drama. In talking about the killer, he said, "We firmly believe it was someone she knew. She was killed in the bedroom, the last room in the house. She wouldn't have let that happen unless she knew who the person was." Joe spoke about his relationship with Rachel, their wedding, and the difficult pregnancies, before the conversation turned back to the day of the murder. He asked Jenny Friel and the photographer that was with her if they would like to see where it had happened. Jenny thought she had misheard him. In a matter-of-fact manner, he said, "It's a bit of a mess because of the work the forensic people had to do. But you can see where we found her." Jenny and her colleague looked into the room from the hallway. Joe stood beside them, pointing out blood spatter on the walls, saying, "There, and that's more blood there." Jenny thought Joe must have been in total shock to be acting this way. She felt so nauseous she had to go to the bathroom to compose herself. Joe then posed for some photographs, making a big play of toying with a gold ring on his left little finger. He explained that it was Rachel's wedding ring. Following the interview, Jenny Friel noted that Joe had never talked about how much he had loved Rachel. He never said that he would miss her. In and around the same time, another photographer, Kieran O'Brien, who worked for the Herald newspaper, also met Joe O'Reilly at Lambay View. As Joe posed for photographs in the kitchen, he told Kieran that the police were treating him as the prime suspect. He then asked Kieran if he wanted to see where Rachel had been found. The blood was still there. Joe began acting out the murder, raining down imaginary blows. He mentioned a dumbbell as the possible weapon. He mimed how the killer must have washed off the blood, mentioning that a towel was missing from the house. Kieran O'Brien made his excuses and left the house as soon as he could. He wasn't gone far when he had to pull over his car to compose himself. Joe O'Reilly would carry out his macabre reenactment again, this time for Rachel's friend, Jackie O'Connor. Jackie was alone with Joe at Lambay View when he laid out his theory of how the murder of her friend unfolded. As she listened to all of this, stunned, Joe told her that he'd seen it in a dream he'd had after falling asleep in the spot where Rachel had died. He said in the dream it was like he was the one killing Rachel. In the dream she was asking him, "Why are you doing this?" When an old friend of Joe's, Alan Boyle, called to the house to sympathise, he asked if Rachel might have been having an affair. Alan was disturbed when Joe replied that he couldn't give a fuck what Rachel got up to. As part of the ongoing investigation, Gardaí gained access to Joe O'Reilly's email account. 5 emails in particular, between Joe and his sister Anne on the 9th of June 2004, gave a glimpse into Joe's true feelings about his wife. In the emails, they discussed how Rachel had been reported to the Child Protection Services for allegedly being rough with the boys. Joe described the meeting as a big steaming pile of shite. It emerged that it had in fact been Joe's mother, Anne Sr., who had reported Rachel to the authorities. He cautioned his sister that Rachel had suspected she was the one behind it. He wrote, "You are prime suspect number 1, you know it. By all means, drag her fat ass outside and kick it into the middle of next week, but not in front of the boys. And don't leave any marks that can and will be used against you in a court of law." Around that time, a district nurse was due to call out to Lambay View, Joe said, hopefully the district nurse will see her at her best, or else the state of the house that the lazy cunt leaves it in. He sarcastically spoke of Rachel as a wonderful mother in the eyes of the state. He was angry because the social worker had described him as the secondary caregiver. He continued, I'm already Mr. Weekend Custody in the eyes of the state. Doesn't bode well, does it? It appeared that what Joe was most concerned about was losing access to his sons. He wrote to his sister, being a father in this country, no matter how good, will land you with weekend visitations and not much else. Yesterday was my first personal indication of how much I will lose if I don't try different angles. He maintained that Rachel had been rough with the boys. If you see her being excessive, then step in. I want to know as much as possible, and I can't be there all the time. And you're my sister, my blood. She's not. Anne replied, so she knows the marriage is over then, and it's a divorce. Joe told his sister that me plus Rachel plus marriage equals over. She repulses me. Rachel's friend, Jackie O'Connor, told investigators that Rachel did indeed suspect that Joe was having an affair, but she had wanted to save her marriage. But things had been going from bad to worse, and so, on the 3rd of October, the day before the murder, she had given Joe an ultimatum. Clean up your act, or everything is going to change. As Gardaí continued to gather evidence, Joe O'Reilly continued to court the media. Joe told the Callalys that he had been contacted by the Late Late Show, inquiring as to whether he and Rose would appear on the show on the next Friday night. After some persuasion, they agreed. On the night of the show, Rose and Jim travelled to the studios at Montrose in a limousine, along with their daughter Anne, Rachel's friend and neighbour Sarah Harmon, and Joe. The limo pulled up outside and the group walked through the glass doors of the TV centre, past the reception desk and up the stairs to the Late Late Show green room. Pat Kenny, the host of the Late Late Show, went to greet them, shaking Joe's hand and offering the Callalys tea and coffee. Joe helped himself to the platter of sandwiches. The Callalys and Sarah, still deep in grief and nervous about being in a television studio, could barely touch anything. As host of the country's flagship talk show, Pat knew to wait to ask the serious questions on air, to keep it fresh for the guests. As he met Rachel's family in the green room, he kept the chat general. His focus was drawn to Rose and Jim, and he offered his condolences on their loss. He shook hands with Joe, but didn't get to speak with him much. Conscious of putting the guests at ease, Kenny told them what to expect when they walked out under the bright studio lights. He explained where they'd be sitting. He reassured them that they didn't have to worry about interrupting each other or wait for him to ask a question. They were free to speak as they wanted to. He reminded them of the purpose of the interview: to help find the killer. Pat left the green room. Joe and the Callalys were brought to get their makeup done. The audience filed into the studio with a little over 30 minutes to go before the show began, with hundreds of thousands across Ireland ready to tune in. Joe was texting non-stop on his phone and chuckling away. A few minutes before the show began, Pat Kenny walked out to the audience and spoke to them, telling them what to expect that evening, sharing a joke or two. The show went live, and Pat Kenny stepped out on stage before the cameras. As Rose Callaly waited to go on air, she looked over at Joe. He wasn't wearing his wedding ring. One of the Late Late Show team, the hospitality hostess, Angela, noticed how Joe very ostensibly and publicly took out a pill and swallowed it. She felt he wanted to be seen doing it. He told her it was for his nerves. When Rose and Joe sat across from Pat Kenny with the cameras rolling, the host could feel a tension between the pair. the audience at home could see it too. Rose held herself stiffly in a black leather armchair with her hands folded in her lap. Whenever Joe spoke, she would lean away from him and stare out into the audience to where Jim, Anne and Sarah were sitting. Joe, however, was eager to answer any of Pat's questions, leaning forward in his seat and cracking small jokes. He seemed to be enjoying it all. Pat Kenny asked Joe what kind of woman Rachel had been. His answer angered Rose. He replied blandly, "Just a normal woman. Just an ordinary person." In contrast, when Pat turned to the studio audience and asked Rachel's sister Anne, who had tears in her eyes, the same question, she replied, she was such an amazing person, a natural nurturer, a fantastic sister, a super wife, a fantastic daughter. Sarah Harmon, who had been the second person at the scene on the day of the murder, added, "There's no replacing Rachel." She burst into tears, and Rachel's dad Jim put his arm around her to comfort her. Joe O'Reilly calmly explained how he had arrived at the scene, describing it as an out-of-body experience. He spoke about the paramedics with their box of tricks and electric shock things. Rose described the scene and told the host, "Pat, she had a horrific death." As she spoke, Joe looked down and pursed his lips. Joe appealed for information, telling the nation there was a lot of blood and therefore there would have been a lot of blood on this person. Before the interview was finished, Joe gave one final insight. Everyone, including myself, is a suspect until this is resolved. Statistically, it's usually the husband, boyfriend, or whatever. If it's someone that we both know, I will be shocked, probably physically sick too. For viewers at home, Joe's behaviour was so odd that some even called the guards themselves to say he was the killer. After the interview, the Callalys, Sarah and Joe were brought back to the green room, and when the Late Late Show was over, Pat Kenny came and spent some time with them. Joe didn't want to hang around and didn't avail of the complimentary hotel room offered. He said that he had to attend a pre-arranged business meeting with some American friends. It was by then past midnight. In those earliest days, and for a long time after, Rachel's parents, Jim and Rose, struggled to keep their grief from consuming and destroying their lives. Their shock became anger, and with nowhere to direct it, they often turned it on each other. They would be laid low in unimaginable pain or consumed by uncontainable fury. Rose struggled to sleep, and those times she did manage to find rest, she wouldn't want to wake, to return to what her life had become. She would walk long walks, crying as she took each step. She would have moments where she felt like maybe she had emerged from the darkest parts of her grief, only to be pulled back in again. About 2 weeks after the infamous Late Late interview, Detective Sergeant Pat Murray was at the Callalys' house, while a journalist was conducting another interview. Joe O'Reilly was in the conservatory with Rose and Jim. He was sitting on the arm of the sofa that the couple were sitting in. Mary was looking in through the glass panel door. Joe turned and looked straight at him. The two locked eyes, neither looking away. It was at that moment that the detective knew with certainty that Joe O'Reilly had murdered his wife. He knew. He was sure. But Mary knew there was still a lot of work to do to prove it beyond doubt. A lot of evidence to gather before the Gardaí could make their move. And there were two key people that they felt would be in a position to give the investigators more information than they had already. On the 16th of November, Nicky Pelly and Derek Querney were arrested on suspicion of withholding information. Querney was brought to Balbriggan Garda Station for questioning, while Pelly was taken to Drogheda. Derek Querney had, up to that point, backed Joe O'Reilly's assertion that he had been in Phibsborough bus depot during the time frame in which Rachel's murder had been committed. But no one at the depot had seen O'Reilly, and he wasn't on any CCTV footage, meaning that the sole corroboration for Joe being there was Derek Querney. Pat Murray had also learned that there were, in fact, only 2 canteens at the bus depot. If Joe had searched in them for the employee he was there to see, he would have been picked up on CCTV. Querney told Gardaí he had spoken to Joe on his phone at 8:56 a.m. and 9:25 a.m. on the day of the murder. When Gardaí asked him where Joe was calling from, Derek said he couldn't be sure, but he thought that Joe had mentioned being at the depot. There was a short break before a second round of questions. In that second period, Querney suddenly got up and vomited into a bin in the corner of the interview room. He said that he was shocked and frightened by the interview. He'd never had dealings with the Gardaí before, and certainly not as a detainee. As the interview went on, he admitted that he believed his first statement to Gardaí, which he'd given on the day of the murder, must have been wrong. He couldn't have seen Joe in Phibsborough prior to 10:30 a.m. on the 4th of October. With that, Joe O'Reilly's alibi was beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, Gardaí were questioning Nicky Pelly at Drogheda Garda Station. She said she and Joe were very much in love and wanted to live together, along with his 2 boys. She had met the boys already, both at her house and on trips to the zoo. Nicky had given Joe an ultimatum. She wasn't prepared to simply remain as the other woman in Joe O'Reilly's life. She told Joe that he had to leave Rachel by November 2004 if he wanted to continue in a relationship with her. She also told the Gardaí that Joe had asked her to play down their relationship. He had said that if the Gardaí knew the extent of the affair, it might look like a motive for murder. Joe had previously told Detective Sergeant Pat Murray that he'd had a brief phone conversation with Nicky around midday on the day of Rachel's murder. But by now, the investigation team had access to the phone records of all the main players. Joe and Nicky had, in fact, 7 interactions by phone on the morning of the 4th of October, with a total of 18 interactions across the whole day. 2 of the earlier calls lasted 27 and 25 minutes respectively, one at 5:45 a.m. and the other at 8:12 a.m. When asked about what they were talking about on those calls, Nicky said that Joe had told her that he'd had a huge row with Rachel the night before, during which he supposedly said he was going to leave her and take the boys with him. Gardaí asked Nicky about Joe's animosity towards his wife, the side of him that they had seen unmasked in those emails. She said his nickname for Rachel was the Wasp, which later changed to the more straightforward cunt. It was becoming clear to the investigators that leaving Rachel and keeping full custody of the kids was Joe O'Reilly's main priority. He wanted to set up house with Nicky Pelly and his sons. Nicky also revealed that following his appearance on The Late Late Show, Joe had not gone to meet business associates as he had claimed. He had spent the night with her. Pieces were falling into place for Gardaí, but for the time being, the DPP directed no charges against Joe O'Reilly. There was no murder weapon, no forensic evidence, no eyewitness. And although Joe's alibi had been weakened, the new timeline would only have given him 18 minutes in which to murder his wife. They needed more information. They needed to talk to Joe. Derek Querney and Nicky Pelly were released without charge the following day, 17th of November. That same day, at 10:20 a.m, Detective Sergeant Pat Murray and some of his colleagues went to Lambay View. They found Joe in the bedroom, where Rachel had been killed. He was barefoot. The curtains were drawn and the room was dark. A shrine to Rachel had been set up near to the spot where she'd been killed. There was a table with a photograph of her on it, surrounded by tea lights. The tea lights twinkled in the dark room. Pat Murray placed his hand on Joe's shoulder and arrested him on suspicion of having murdered his wife. The arrest took place beside the shrine. Pat said to Joe, "Very poignant, Joe, that you're right on the spot." Joe O'Reilly said nothing. He was brought to Drogheda Garda station while a search of the house was carried out. The detectives got to see Joe's Star Wars collection, including several costumes in the attic. Notably, his favourite, the Darth Vader costume, was missing. During questioning, Joe was largely uncooperative, and the Gardaí gained no further useful information. He was released without charge later that night. It was frustrating, but the Gardaí knew the investigation was nowhere near over. Any investigation, especially a murder investigation, requires methodical preparation. The evidence must be ready to be put before a court, and it has to be unshakable. Dozens of Gardaí were now involved in the investigation into Rachel O'Reilly's murder, both local guards and detectives from the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation. There were daily case conferences, with all of them working together to gather as much evidence and information as possible. It was one of the largest murder investigations in years, with over 700 witness statements eventually being taken. To those watching from outside on Garda Síochána, as 2004 gave way to 2005, it perhaps seemed like things had gone quiet with the case. But there was vital and damning evidence still to come. I remember having to travel to Ennis in County Clare in February of 2005. I was part of a bureau team sent to assist in the investigation of a brutal murder of a local taxi driver. It was late by the time we arrived at our digs, the 2 Mile Inn, which was a popular spot for Gardaí on the road at the time. I got talking to a detective superintendent in the bar and happened to bring up the Rachel O'Reilly case, which was still very much in the media at the time. I remarked that things had gone a bit quiet with it. He responded, "Just wait. Something is coming that's going to crack it wide open." The Callaly family too, now convinced of Joe's guilt, feared that the case was going cold. Then Jim thought back to the letters they had written and placed in the coffin with Rachel. And he wondered, what if Joe had admitted something in his letter? Those letters he knew Rachel would take with her into the grave. Those letters he was sure would never be seen by anyone else. In March of 2005, Gardaí sought permission from the then Minister for Justice, Michael McDowell, and Rachel's family to exhume her remains. With the permission granted, the exhumation took place in the early hours of the 8th of March 2005 at Balgriffin Cemetery. None of Rachel's family were present, as they were attending the inquest into her death, which also started that day. Unfortunately, the lid of the coffin had broken since the time of Rachel's burial, and all of the letters within were in poor condition. Nevertheless, they were retrieved by the bureau team and brought back to the Forensic Science Laboratory in Garda headquarters, where they underwent a special drying procedure. In the letter that Joe O'Reilly had written, he professed his love for Rachel. "Rachel, I love you so very, very much. I cannot think what I will ever do without you." It was a far cry from the scathing language that he'd used in the emails to his sister. The letter ended, "Rachel, I love you, and I miss you, and I will mourn you forever. XXX, your hubby-wubby, Jofes." There were no admissions or confessions, but he did include a curious sentence. "This is the hardest letter I've ever had to write, for reasons only we know. Rachel, forgive me. 2 words, 1 sentence, but I will say them forever." It was curious, but it carried no evidential weight. It would be the following year before Joe O'Reilly was again formally questioned by the Gardaí. He was arrested for the second time on the 14th of March 2006 and questioned about his emails and also his calls and text messages to Nicky Pelly on the day of Rachel's murder. Joe was interviewed 5 times, but remained detached and largely uncooperative throughout, mostly answering no comment to the questions put to him. Once again, he was released without charge. As Joe left the station, he turned to look at Detective Sergeant Pat Murray and gave him a brazen thumbs up. Pat stared back at him, squashing the urge to drag him back in. Later the same day, Gardaí also rearrested Nicky Pelly. Gardaí had received information from a friend of hers who remembered Nicky telling her about the affair with Joe O'Reilly. Nicky had remarked to her that Joe had told her that he would kill Rachel if he thought he could get away with it. This interaction was put to Nicky during questioning, and she confirmed that the conversation had indeed taken place. She was released without charge the following day. And then the months ticked by. The investigation team had hundreds of lines of inquiry to pursue. 119 pieces of CCTV footage were gathered, from cameras in various locations in North Dublin and around Joe's workplace, Viacom. A Navy Fiat Marea, the same as Joe drove, was seen in this CCTV footage, but the number plate was unclear. Unable to positively identify Joe's car, the Gardaí set about eliminating any other possibilities. There were 2,500 Navy Marea estates registered in Ireland at that time. They began tracking down each car to slowly rule out everyone other than Joe O'Reilly. Footage from the reception area of Viacom showed him leaving at 8:07 a.m, corroborated by another camera showing him exiting the industrial estate at 8:12 a.m. Rachel's Renault Scenic was shown passing Murphy's Quarry near her home at 9:03 a.m. on her way to drop off the boys. Just minutes later, at 9:10 a.m, the Navy Fiat Marea, allegedly Joe's car, was seen passing the quarry going in the direction of Lambay View. At 9:41 a.m, what was believed to be Rachel's car is seen passing the quarry on the way back home. 18 minutes later, just before 10 o'clock, the Navy Fiat is seen again, this time driving away from Lambay View, heading back towards the city. Investigators also reached out to the mobile phone provider O2 Ireland with a view to obtaining Joe's phone records and to trace the calls made and received on the day of the murder. When a person sends or receives a text or makes or receives a call on a mobile phone, the signal is picked up in real time by the nearest mast, or pings off it, leaving an indelible geographical marker of the phone user. The pinging of Joe's phone would allow the engineers at O2 to track his movements by identifying the phone mast his phone was communicating with at any given time. It was a new technology, and it was never used before in a murder investigation. It was a groundbreaking tool for Gardaí. It would allow them to track Joe O'Reilly's mobile phone location history for the day of the murder. Those phone records told a story. At 8:46 a.m. on the morning of Rachel's death, Nicky Pelly texted Joe. Based off what he had told Gardaí, he should have been on his way to Phibsborough, but the phone record showed he was on the M50, heading away from the city. His reply to Nicky was picked up on a mast around 17 miles from Lambay View. At 8:56 a.m, Derek Kearney called Joe. They had claimed they had been at the bus depot in Phibsborough together, but Joe's phone showed him far away in North County Dublin. He was just 5 miles from his home. Derek rang Joe again at 9:25 a.m. This time, Joe's phone pinged off the mast less than half a mile from home. A text received by Joe at 9:52 a.m. showed that the phone was still pinging off the same mast. Joe called Derek at 10:04 a.m. His phone showed that he was heading back in the direction of Dublin City. At 11:49 a.m, CCTV captured him driving back into Viacom, where he would be seen by a colleague, who would tell Gardaí she thought Joe looked like shit. The timing and location of signals registered by each telephone mast from Joe's mobile phone aligned perfectly with the CCTV sightings of the Navy car spotted making the same journey. The trip took place during the time that Joe claimed, without any witnesses, that he was at the Phibsborough bus depot. Detective Garda Jim McGovern drove the route at the same times as shown on the CCTV footage. He brought his mobile phone with him. It was shown that his phone had registered or pinged off the same masts that Joe's had, at almost exactly the same times. Shortly after the second anniversary of Rachel's death, Joe was arrested for a third time. Joe was at his mother's house in Dunleer, standing in the kitchen in his stocking feet, when Detective Sergeant Pat Murray arrested him for the purposes of charging him with Rachel O'Reilly's murder. Murray watched O'Reilly's face go white. Joe said 6 words to him. "Can I put my shoes on?" Those would be the last words exchanged between the detective and his quarry. The trial of Joe O'Reilly opened on the 18th of June 2007, before Justice Barry White. O'Reilly pleaded not guilty. The trial was in danger of collapsing right at the start, when one of the jurors had purportedly been heard to say that she thought O'Reilly was guilty. An agreement was reached between the prosecution and the defence that this juror would be let go and that the trial could proceed with a jury of 11. Then proceedings almost collapsed for a second time, when part of the book of evidence was discovered in the jury room. But each member of the jury swore, under oath, that they hadn't read any part of it. The prosecution's case consisted of mainly circumstantial evidence. The court heard of the extent of Joe's affair with Nicky Pelly. They heard of his reenactments of the murder. Evidence was heard from Dr. Mary Cassidy, describing Rachel's wounds. Blood spatter analysis evidence was given by Dr. Diane Daly of the Forensic Science Laboratory. Joe's letter to Rachel, the one he had left in her coffin, was read into evidence, as were his emails to his sister, in which he had criticised his wife. When Rachel's family got to hear the contents of the emails, they were extremely upset at the completely fictitious descriptions of Rachel's lack of motherly instincts, and how she was subjected to cruel criticism, day in and day out. Rose, in particular, felt this treatment must have eroded any confidence or joy she felt rearing her 2 beloved children. With Rachel now dead, she had no chance to clear her good name. The most crucial prosecution evidence was the CCTV information and the data pertaining to Joe's mobile phone. The prosecution's version of events on the morning of 4th of October 2004 was this. After dropping her 2 boys off at school and creche, Rachel returned home to Lambay View. She entered through the back door and headed to the bedroom. When she entered the room, Joe was waiting for her, likely with a dumbbell in his hand. He swung it at her head, stunning her. Her car keys must have fallen from her hand and landed on the floor, onto which she then fell. He then continued to hit her, just like in his grisly reenactments, bending down to inflict as much damage as possible. He then walked towards the ensuite, but Rachel had made a noise and he went back to hit her again, killing her. He then had time to clean himself up and must have changed his clothes. He made an unconvincing attempt to make it look like a botched burglary, emptying drawers and cabinets. But crucially, he forgot about the cash in Rachel's purse and in the container in the utility room. It's likely that he had already placed the bags with the camcorder and jewellery box into the ditch prior to the events of that morning, showing premeditation for the murder. He then left the house. Later, when the creche called him to say that Rachel had not picked up their youngest son, he made several calls and sent several texts to Rachel's phone, feigning concern. Then he called Rachel's friends and her family. He urged Rose Callaly to go to the house, knowing full well what she would find there. The headmaster at the school where the eldest O'Reilly boy had been attending gave evidence that when Joe had arrived to pick up his son, the boy had already left with Rachel's friend, Michelle Mulligan. Joe had appeared calm and collected, and to the headmaster it appeared that Joe was hanging about, seemingly wasting time. It struck the headmaster as not the demeanour you would expect from a man whose wife was supposedly missing. It would later become apparent that Joe was delaying going home, ensuring that Rose would get there first. In the prosecution's telling of that morning, Joe O'Reilly not only took Rose's daughter from her, but plotted to have her find Rachel's lifeless body. He condemned Rose to be haunted by that horrific scene for the rest of her life. The jury retired to deliberate on Friday the 20th of July. The deliberations continued on into Saturday, and by 6:40 p.m. that evening, hope of a verdict was dwindling. Then came a soft knock on the door leading to the jury's chambers. The verdict was in, and it was unanimous. The atmosphere in the room shifted with the sudden anticipation. Crowds piled into the courtroom. The Callalys prayed under their breath. Joe O'Reilly read a text message and inhaled deeply. Then, under the dome of the old Central Criminal Court, the foreman read the verdict. Guilty. Cheers went up around the room as the Callalys and Rachel's friends broke down in loud sobs. Tears ran down the faces of the investigating gardai. All of the stress and tension that they had lived with for nearly 3 years could finally be let out. Joe O'Reilly's face was blank as Justice Barry White gave him the mandatory life sentence. As he was being led away, through a jeering crowd calling him a murderer and a scumbag, he asked one of the prison officers, "What's the food like in Mountjoy?" He never expressed remorse for the crime he had been convicted of, nor did he make any comment or apology to the Callaly family. O'Reilly lodged an appeal against his conviction in December 2008, but in March 2009 it was dismissed by 3 appeal judges. To date he has applied for parole 4 times. Each application has been denied. He still maintains his innocence and is regularly visited in prison by Nicky Pelly. The simplest explanation as to why he murdered Rachel is that he'd fallen out of love with her and in love with Nicky. His love for his wife had turned into hate. He thought he could simply get rid of her, and he and his sons and his new partner could be a new family, replacing the old one. The 2 boys, who were only 4 and 3 years of age when their man was murdered, were taken care of by the O'Reilly family, but still maintained contact with the Callalys. Rachel's children were everything to her. She had 2 boxes at home, one for each of her sons. She called them their treasure chests. She would put little things into them from time to time, and intended to keep on doing so, right up until they were grown and about to move out. Then she was going to give each of them their treasure chests. But, tragically, this wouldn't come to pass. Rachel would only get to dress her eldest in his school uniform, all set for big school, for 4 short weeks. Pat Marry retired from Garda Síochána in 2018. In his book, The Making of a Detective, he said of Joe O'Reilly, there was a childlike side to him, so maybe a part of him never grew up. And of course, there was a darkness in him. A side less obvious, a side he hid. He was obsessed with Star Wars, and his kids spoke of how he loved to dress up as his favourite character. Darth Vader, the once good man who was seduced by the dark side of the Force. Pat commented on this years later. He said he would often wonder why Gardaí never found the Darth Vader costume in the house. Also never found was the murder weapon. Had it been a dumbbell, as Joe was fond of telling people? In 2013, a dumbbell was found in a stream near Beldara, but it had lain outside in the elements for so long that no forensic evidence could be gleaned from it. Lambay View lay vacant for several years before it was finally bought and refurbished in 2015. Throughout the murder investigation and the ensuing trial, Rachel's family received hundreds of letters of support, many from people who had never met them or Rachel. These letters were a tremendous support to them during that terrible time. With the trial over and various legalities ironed out, Rachel's family were finally able to erect a headstone on her grave in Balgriffin Cemetery. It was in her maiden name, Callaly. It read, "Cherished memories of Rachel. Murdered 4th of October 2004, aged 30 years. Tragically, Rachel's sister Anne was added to the headstone in September of 2010. She had developed a cancerous tumour behind her eye, and although she'd had it removed, she would sadly pass away at the age of 32. Rachel's dad, Jim, would pass away suddenly at home on the 1st of February 2024. He was 83. Rose Callaly still lives in Dublin. In her book, Remembering Rachel, she gave tribute to her daughter. "She is the brightest star I see when I look up at the night sky. She never leaves my mind and is my constant companion. But I wish I could be given another chance to have her back again. It is the reality of knowing that that can never happen that is so very hard to live with." Speaking of her daughter, Rose said in her book, "I always feel very sad when I see apples growing on those trees that Rachel planted, and know she is no longer around to see them. Her beautiful spirit will always stay with me, and I know that someday I will be able to make sense of it all. I hope the sun is shining on her all the time now, and that she feels very much loved and cherished. I know that, wherever she is, it is a better place since she has arrived there." Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Inquiry. We have set up an Instagram page. If you're there, please give us a follow at Lines of Inquiry Podcast. We have an email address, linesofinquiry@goloudnow.com, and we would love to hear from you, so get in touch. Whether you have a story you think we should cover, or just want to let us know how you felt about an episode. That email is linesofinquiry@goloudnow.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, leaving a rating or review really helps. We've now received almost 5,000 five-star ratings across Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Those responses make a real difference. They help new listeners find the series, and I am genuinely humbled by the response we've gotten. Thank you. Your support helps us to tell these stories. Make sure to like or follow the podcast in your podcast app and hit the notifications button, so you'll know every time a new episode is released. Lines of Inquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Eoin Brennan. Our producers are Siobhan Maguire and Siobhan Walsh. Sound editing and design is by Neil Kavanagh, with additional editing support from Ed Smith. This episode was written by me, John Sweetman, and edited by Siobhan Walsh and Eoin Brennan. Social media, marketing, video and legal support comes from the GoLoud team. In the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.